POCO F3. Not a flagship killer, but definitely a great successor. If you're new to the channel, thanks for joining me. I create videos about tech but mostly about gadgets, and if you want to see more videos in the future, feel free to subscribe to the channel. So it's been over a month since POCO F3 launched, and I've been using this phone for a month now. Just so you know, this phone is selling as a Redmi K40 in China, and its name globally is POCO F3, under the popular and independent Pocophone brand. It's not following the footsteps of the POCO F2 Pro, but instead replacing the Mi 9T that also launched globally in 2019. As a refresher, the Mi 9T was one of, if not the most affordable AMOLED phones you could get. It even had a Snapdragon 730, which was enough to power the most demanding games back then. But 2 years later, we now have the successor, the POCO F3. And if you check the spec sheet, this phone comes with significant upgrades, such as the 120Hz Super AMOLED display, a flagship level chip in the Snapdragon 870, and a fast 33-watt charger in the box. While it definitely has the makings of a flagship phone, there's one area where this phone falls short to be called a flagship killer, and that's the camera. So right off the bat, POCO F3's camera won't win any awards despite the triple camera setup. The main sensor is using a 48 megapixel instead of a 64 megapixel or 108 megapixel that we saw on the Redmi Note 10 Pro or Pro Max, which is another mid-range phone. The ultra-wide camera has been downgraded from 13 to 8 megapixel, but POCO did add a 5 megapixel macro because it's a thing now. You still have the 20 megapixel selfie camera, but it's now inside a pinhole cutout instead of a pop-up module. Quality-wise, I would say POCO F3 has above average cameras. The sharpness is okay, the colors are okay, and the dynamic range is good for the price. As expected from this price range, photos tend to get blurry and noisy in challenging scenarios, even with sufficient indoor lighting, and white balance leans towards cooler tones. I also noticed that colors are a bit contrasty compared with other devices. It has a weird tendency to darken solid colors, which weirdly happens to faces as well. So if you take a selfie with any of the cameras, your face ends up darker than usual. You might like it, but some people might not, especially if one is coming from an Oppo or Vivo phone. For the macro lens, it's surprisingly decent. 5 megapixel appears to be enough to get you sharp close-up shots, and having that autofocus also help in that regard. But if you really want to capture consistent sharp macro photos, I recommend leaving the flash on when doing so. Although the 20 megapixel selfie camera is lacking in detail preservation, the overall quality is pretty good for the price. I do have to say that it's one of the widest selfie cameras that I've seen on a phone, so getting those group shots should be easier with POCO F3. Night mode shots deliver a subtle effect on photos, giving you a little sharper and a little brighter output without messing up the white balance. But you can usually get these in night mode shots with the ultra-wide lens, which is pretty impressive for an 8 megapixel sensor. Video, on the other hand, is stable in most cases, and the dynamic range is good. Where the quality kind of falls apart is when you switch indoors. POCO F3 tries its best to maintain that sharp quality, but ends up making the video noisy and grainy. There's no 4K 60 option, nor any 4K video on the ultra-wide for some reason, but overall, given you have enough lighting, the video quality is good. There are two video modes that I'm seeing for the first time. One is the audio zoom in that boosts the sound of the subject as you zoom in, and the AI mode that basically delivers that ultra stable footage at 1080p. I don't use it that much, but if you need it, it's there. The camera is clearly not the best feature of this phone, but it's all good things from here. That said, let me start with the design. POCO F3 is so refreshing to use after coming from the X3 NFC and X3 Pro, simply because it's a lot thinner and lighter than those two devices. POCO F3 feels thin in the hand at 7.8mm despite weighing 196 grams. The railing seems to be off metal with glossy chamfered edges and a glossy top portion. There are 6 holes up top, which I assume to be for the stereo speakers but doesn't really block sound when covered. And also, the speaker beside the earpiece is a bit exposed. As you can see, the gap is a bit wider, leaving an area for dust and lint to stick around. The right hand side slightly curves away to make way for the buttons, which is a nice touch, and the fingerprint scanner that feels like it's part of the frame itself is fast and accurate. If you're wondering why there's a capacitive scanner here, I'm guessing it's one of the ways to achieve the phone's price point. There's no headphone jack here unfortunately, so you have to make do with the included adapter in the box if you want to use your existing wired headphones. But if you're opting for wireless earbuds, this phone supports the wireless AAC codec, and the recent arrival of Dolby Atmos effect via a software update just made the overall sound quality a little better. The speakers have a bit of a punch and depth and deliver clear dialogue even at the highest volume, but the low end and high end do get muddy at that point. The back portion is using a frosted glass finish with Gorilla Glass 5 and is definitely slippery but doesn't attract and show fingerprint smudges that much, particularly with this white model that I got. The black model is your typical glossy phone, but the blue model? I actually have yet to see an actual model of that device, which comes with a branding and geometric pattern. But regardless, this white version is really clean and a joy to use. The camera module is sitting on top of another glass or plastic frame of some kind. It's actually hard to tell what kind of material, but the edges feel like plastic to me. POCO didn't have to do that, but I think it adds a bit of subtle flair and uniqueness to the device, given that the F3 resembles the flagship Mi 11. I really like how POCO F3 looks and feels, although that flat panel does make the phone feel wider in my hands. It's better than having a curved front display though. Well, that's what I was supposed to say if only POCO implemented some sort of palm rejection. I mentioned this as one of my top 5 issues in a separate video, and since then POCO has yet to address this problem. My guess is that the display is too sensitive that slight palm touches are easily recognizable as regular touches. In fact, some of my swipe to scroll are registered as touches, but if you're going to use a case, you'll fare better. Shout out to the comment section for pointing that one out. Since we're on the topic of the display, this 6.67-inch AMOLED panel is definitely punching above its weight class. It is punchy, contrasty, and sharp. POCO claimed that it can reach up to 1300 nits peak brightness when watching HDR content, and I think that's accurate. But what's not accurate is the typical brightness whenever you're just scrolling through feeds or navigating around a UI. I noticed that the panel barely gets bright unless you set the level to around 90%. In fact, JSM Arena also had the same issue, to which they said 200 nits are achieved at about 85% of the slider, and the other 300 plus nits are represented by the last 15% of the slider movement. POCO F3's display certainly has the ability to get bright, but it's disappointing to know that the manual slider manages up to 500 nits only, and you have to use auto brightness just to reach that 700 nits level. Other than being bright, the display also has a couple of tricks up its sleeve. In the settings, you have the option to enable AI HDR enhancement on non-HDR videos, as well as turn on MEMC to achieve that soap opera-like effect. For MEMC, it's just a gimmick at this point. It basically works like 10% of the time and at burst periods. But for that AI HDR, it does make the video quality punchier, albeit with warmer tones. I find it useful when watching animated videos, but if it's regular content like vlogs or movies, I prefer it turned off. Also, if the video was already HDR, it doesn't reapply AI HDR, which is a smart thing to do for a phone. There's also a pinhole for the selfie camera, which is one of the smallest that I've seen so far, although it sucks that there's no notification LED. I read a lot about screen dimming by other users. I only had one instance where I encountered this, and that was playing Genshin Impact for a few minutes. It basically slightly reduced the brightness in the middle of the game. It's not a big deal to me, but those who are playing competitively may find it annoying and distracting. Speaking of gaming, the Snapdragon 870 can handle everything you throw at it. While my unit is only paired with 6GB RAM and 128GB storage, I never felt the need for the 8GB model because MIUI 12 on POCO F3 just flies. Everything is just fluid and fast. I would even say that it's as fast as the Mi 10T that I reviewed a few months ago. One area where POCO needs to do more is the integration of Google Feed. It's nice that it's there, but at least make it optimized because it stutters a lot. In my case, I just use a widget that requires only a single tap and is much optimized. Also, there were times when YouTube videos drop frames when switching orientations or double tapping to skip. I also encountered Messenger bubbles turned Messenger squares. MIUI practically overridden bubbles with its own version, which is clunky and buggy. I can even reply to a chat without blocking my reply. And yes, there is still bloatware out of the box. I'm just glad that they are easily uninstallable. MIUI also has to do a better job in delivering notifications on time. There were instances where some of my messages, emails, and tweet notifs arrived not until I turned on the screen, but not as often as the XT Pro and other less expensive Xiaomi devices. Oh, and the haptic feedback is also subtle and tight. Though if you want the same tactility when typing, make sure the vibration level in the keyboard setting is set to default because changing it would only give you regular vibration. I also appreciate POCO F3 letting me add functions to the fingerprint scanner like double touch tap to open the camera, as well as the double and triple tap on the back of the phone to turn on the flashlight. But obviously all that power needs the energy to function, and the 4520 mAh battery is just enough to last you a full day. I can still easily drain the battery at early night, especially when playing games for a couple of hours, but with my regular usage of mostly watching videos, my typical screen time is between 4.5 and nearly 6 hours. Do take note that this is usually in a full 24-hour cycle and not your typical 15-hour a day of usage. In other words, the battery is impressive despite the powerful chip and faster display. Although I have to warn you that setting always on display to turn on every time a notification comes in can drain your battery overnight. And no, there's no wireless charging here. As for that 33-watt charger that I had problems with, Xiaomi found that the cable included was defective, so they sent out a new one. With a new cable, I can finally get over to a full tank in just a little over an hour. So in the end, POCO F3 may not be the flagship killer that we waited for since POCO F2 Pro, but it's definitely the best value phone, when on sale, that almost delivers the closest thing to a flagship killer. I can easily recommend this to anyone who's looking to own a phone that could last at least 2 years, and while the photo quality isn't the best, at its price range, there's enough sharpness out of the 48 megapixel sensor. Oh, there's even IP53 dust and splash resistance, which is better than nothing. If you're going to ask me whether 108 megapixel phones are worth getting over POCO F3, I'd say that it's better to deal with an aging camera that's still good today than to deal with an aging performance that's easily replaceable tomorrow. So that's it for my POCO F3 review. Feel free to support the channel by leaving a like or comment or dropping a sub. And as always, until the next one, stay safe.